The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. I stood frozen near the kitchen counter, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Jason's piercing gaze locked onto mine, the weight of his unspoken words pressing down on me like a heavy storm cloud. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could anchor me to something sane. "Jason, you are my stepson. Stop making advances at me." "I can't help it." The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth. A final warning, a desperate attempt to stop whatever was brewing between us. Jason didn't flinch. If anything, his lips curled into the faintest smirk, one that sent a dangerous chill down my spine. "Then stop pretending you don't feel it too," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I turned away, hoping that if I didn't look at him, if I didn't acknowledge the tension, it would disappear. But it was too late. I wasn't sure when it started, when the lines blurred, when the innocent dynamic of a stepmother and stepson shifted into something unspoken, something forbidden. I wasn't always this woman. I used to be the perfect wife, the loyal partner, the woman who kept her desires locked away in a neatly folded box. But Daniel, Jason's father, was hardly ever around. His work pulled him away for weeks, sometimes months at a time, leaving me alone in this big, empty house. And Jason was always there, watching. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Before I ever became Daniel's wife, I was a highly sought-after event planner. My career was something I had built from scratch. Long nights, back-to-back meetings, and perfecting every tiny detail to make sure my clients were satisfied. I wasn't just another woman looking for a wealthy man to marry. I was already successful in my own right. Daniel and I had crossed paths multiple times at different business conferences. He was always there, sometimes as a keynote speaker, sometimes just as an attendee, but I never paid much attention. To me, he was just another powerful businessman in the crowd. But then, one year, everything changed. It was at a luxury business retreat in Dubai. I was handling the logistics, ensuring everything ran smoothly. I caught him watching me from across the room a few times, but I ignored it. He was older, sophisticated, and clearly someone important. But that night, during the gala dinner, he approached me directly. "You do incredible work," he said. "I've been watching how you handle things." I laughed lightly. "Well, that's my job. It's impressive. I know how difficult it is to keep things running this flawlessly." That conversation was the beginning of something unexpected. From there, Daniel started attending more of my events, finding reasons to talk to me. Eventually, he asked me out. I was hesitant at first. He was older, a widower, and carried a history I wasn't sure I was ready to step into. But he was kind, intelligent, and made me feel valued. So I said yes, and before I knew it, I had become his wife. Jason had never been a problem. In fact, when I first entered their lives, I thought I was lucky. He was polite, reserved, and well-mannered. There were no fights, no drama, no resentment. If anything, he was distant, but I chalked it up to the fact that he was already a grown man with his own life. Jason was successful, just like his father. He worked in finance, had a beautiful home of his own, and a thriving career. But there was one thing I noticed. There was no woman in his life. At first, I thought maybe he was just focused on his career. But as time went on, I started to wonder, was he not into women at all? He never spoke about dating, never brought a woman home, never showed any signs of being in a relationship. I never gave it much thought, until something changed. It started during one particularly hot summer. The house was practically an oven, and I started wearing more comfortable clothes, shorts, tank tops, light sundresses. Nothing inappropriate, but definitely different from the conservative outfits I usually wore around Jason. That's when I noticed it. The way his eyes would follow me when I walked past. How he'd pause mid-sentence when I bent down to grab something. The quick glances he thought I wouldn't catch. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Jason had always been reserved, almost uninterested in me. But now it was clear. He was looking at me differently. And that was when everything changed. One evening, I was washing dishes when Jason walked into the kitchen, standing just a little too close. "Dad's away again," he said, voice casual, but there was something underneath, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just us in this big house." He didn't say anything, just stared for a moment too long before walking away. My skin prickled. I shook it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But that was just the beginning. The weeks that followed were filled with small moments that I tried to ignore, his hand brushing against mine when passing the remote, the way his fingers lingered on my back when squeezing past me in the hallway. I chalked it up to nothing, to my overactive mind. Then one night, he took it a step further. I was in my bedroom, reading, when there was a soft knock. Jason stepped in without waiting for a response. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. "You're lonely, aren't you?" I tensed, gripping the book in my hands. "Jason, go to bed." He took a slow step forward. "He's never here. I see the way you look when he calls, like you're waiting for him to say he's coming home. But he never does he?" I swallowed, looking away. "Jason, one day, you won't tell me to stop." He turned and walked away, leaving me breathless, shaken, and undeniably aware that we had crossed into dangerous territory. "Jason!" I called out. "Come in." His voice was low, softer than usual. I opened the door, and there he was, sitting on the edge of his bed, looking up at me like he had been waiting all night. His eyes softened the moment he saw me, a smile curving on his lips. "I just thought you could use that hug," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. The warmth of the embrace should have been comforting, simple, harmless. But the moment his arms wrapped around my waist, pulling me just a little too close, I felt it, the shift. His hands rested against my lower back, lingering longer than they should have. His breath brushed against my neck, and then, without warning, I felt it, a soft peck against my cheek. Before I could react, his lips grazed the corner of my mouth, hovering dangerously close to mine. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen between panic and something far more confusing. "Jason," I whispered, pulling back just enough to create space between us. "You're my stepson. This isn't right." His eyes didn't waver. Instead, he smiled softly, like I had said something amusing rather than shutting down a dangerous line. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever met," he murmured. His fingers brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle but deliberate. "You're not just my stepmother. You're more than that." His words hit me like a wave, an overwhelming mixture of shock, guilt, and something I didn't want to admit was desire. For a moment, my body betrayed me, leaning slightly into his touch before I forced myself to pull away. I stood up quickly, adjusting my blouse, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "This can't happen, Jason," I said firmly, though my voice wavered at the end. "It's wrong. I'm married to your father. You're my stepson." He didn't look ashamed. He didn't back down. Instead, he leaned back on the bed, that same frustratingly confident smile on his lips. "You say it's wrong, but I see it in your eyes," he said smoothly. "You want me to." I turned away, gripping the doorframe tightly to ground myself. My body felt hot, my thoughts racing in a whirlwind of emotions, anger, guilt, and something terrifyingly close to temptation. I forced myself to leave the room without another word, closing the door behind me. But the worst part, deep down in the quiet, shameful parts of my mind, I knew he was right. I was starting to want him too, and that terrified me more than anything else. One evening, I was in the backyard watering the plants when Jason approached me. He took the hose from my hands, turning it off, his fingers grazing mine. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice more uncertain than I wanted it to be. "Stop pretending," he said, stepping closer. My breath hitched. "Pretending what?" "That you don't want me to." I was about to step back when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Daniel was home. I shoved Jason away, heart hammering as I rushed inside to greet my husband, guilt twisting in my stomach like a knife. But when I glanced back at Jason, he was smirking, his expression smug, as if he knew this wasn't over. I tried to distance myself. I avoided being alone with Jason, stopped responding to his texts, and threw myself into my marriage, desperate to remind myself that I was a good wife. But Jason wasn't letting go. The tension in the house was unbearable now, thicker than the summer air, heavier than any guilt I had ever known. I was trying to keep my distance, to remind myself that I was Daniel's wife, not some reckless woman playing with fire. But Jason was relentless. The texts kept coming. They were never overt, always just subtle enough to blur the lines between innocent affection and something far more dangerous. Jason, can you come to the guest house? I need to see you. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. Every part of me screamed to ignore it, to delete it, and move on like it never happened. But my fingers hovered over the screen, frozen. What if he really needed something? What if I was just being paranoid? I reasoned with myself, one quick visit, nothing more. I would set boundaries, make it clear that whatever this was had to stop. So I went. The guest house was quiet, the lights dimmed low. I pushed open the door slowly, anxiety prickling across my skin like static. Jason! I called out softly, my voice barely above a whisper. You texted me. What's wrong? Then I saw him. He stood there in the middle of the room, wearing nothing but a pair of gray sweatpants. His chest was bare, broad and defined in a way I had tried not to notice before. The dim lighting cast shadows across his muscles, making every detail stand out far too clearly. My breath hitched in my throat. I immediately turned my gaze toward the floor, heat rushing to my face. Jason, what's going on? I asked, my voice shaky now. You asked to see me. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name, something dangerous. You came, he said quietly, as if surprised by my presence. Of course I did, I snapped, trying to mask my fear with frustration. You said it was important. What's the problem, Jason? Suddenly, he moved fast, too fast for me to react. Before I could process what was happening, he closed the space between us and pressed his lips against mine. His hands cupped my face, pulling me deeper into the kiss. I froze. For one horrifying moment, I let myself kiss him back, just for a second. His lips were warm, demanding, and full of every unspoken thing that had been building between us for months. Then clarity hit me like a slap. I pulled away sharply, gasping for air. No, Jason, stop. But he didn't let go right away. His hands lingered on my face, and that was when I felt it. The physical proof of his desire pressed against me through the thin fabric of his sweatpants. I stumbled back, panic exploding in my chest. You're my stepson, I choked out, voice raw with fear and confusion. This isn't right. It can't happen. But instead of shame, Jason just smiled, slow, confident, like he knew something I didn't. You can't deny this forever, he whispered. You want me to. I can see it in your eyes. That was it. I turned on my heel and ran, out of the guest house, through the yard, back into the main house where the air suddenly felt too thin. I slammed my bedroom door behind me and locked it, sinking to the floor as my heart raced in my chest. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his touch, his lips, the weight of what almost happened. But the worst part wasn't the guilt. The worst part was that tiny, traitorous part of me that had wanted more. And that terrified me more than anything else. The final straw came when Jason knocked on my bedroom door in the middle of the night. I opened it, heart pounding. Tell me to leave, and I will, he said. But if you don't... I stood there, frozen. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then, I don't know how long I can keep resisting. 4 months, I've tried to ignore the tension, the way Jason pushes boundaries, the way my own emotions are tangled in something I never expected. The worst part, a part of me wonders what would happen if I gave in. But I can't. I won't. I've always prided myself on my discipline, on my ability to stay in control. But everyone has an elastic limit, and I feel mine stretching thinner with each passing day. So now I turn to you, my viewers. This is a true story. I need your advice. What would you do in my position? Jason is relentless. His father, my husband, is hardly ever around. The house feels like a trap, every room filled with a tension I can't escape. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Comment below. Every response will be read. I need to know, before it's too late.